Next, please join me in welcoming on stage Jay Newton-Small, founder and CEO of Memory Well, a web-based platform that chronicles the stories of people with dementia. Jay has been a journalist for more than 15 years and has written for Time Magazine and Bloomberg News as well. Memory Well was born when Jay's father entered an assisted living facility, and instead of filling out a 20-page questionnaire to assist his nursing staff, Jay chose to write the story of her father's life. Thanks to Jay and other writers at Memory Well, there are many Alzheimer's patients whose life stories are being preserved for posterity. Welcome, Jay, and welcome back, Bob.
Thanks, Jack. We were talking backstage about that article in the Washington Post, and I remember it was a month after the 2016 election, so I was recovering from it. And I was reading this fascinating story about you and your family. Can you kind of relay that, because you can do a much better job than I would, and how that led to the formation of your company?
Sure. So my dad was diagnosed with Alzheimer's when I was still a senior in college, and my mother cared for him for the first decade after his diagnosis, but like 40% of Alzheimer's and related dementia caregivers, she actually ended up passing before he did of a stress-induced brain aneurysm in 2011. And so she died very suddenly, and I became my father's caregiver at that point. I was an only child, and I was covering politics at the time for Time Magazine. And so I flew down to Florida and got my dad, moved him up to Washington, D.C. This is not working, sorry. I became his primary caregiver at that point, and I tried to take care of him at home for a while, and that ended up being sort of disastrous on a lot of levels. He would try to cook, and he was used to an electric stove, and I have a gas stove, and I'd come home to a house full of gas, and he'd walk my dog, something he'd done for a decade, and then 5 hours later, and police and fire would find him miles away, and so it was clear that I couldn't care for him at home anymore, and so eventually I had to move him into a community, and when I did, as they said, they asked me to fill out this enormous 20-page questionnaire. And I was sitting there trying to write down these answers, thinking, I was a professional writer with Time, and I challenge anybody to successfully describe their parents' 50-plus year marriage in 4 lines. And
a little more complicated.
Yeah.
Right.
And then B, who was ever going to read and remember 20 pages of handwritten data points for the more than 100 residents in that particular community? Nobody, right? And so instead I was like, look, I'm a writer. I think it's easier for me and easier for you if you just let me write down his story. And they loved it. It was, I printed it out. It was 1 page, double-sided, handed it out to everybody in the community. And they remembered it. They told each other about it. 2 of his caregivers were Ethiopian, and they'd actually had no idea that he'd lived in Ethiopia for 4 years early on in his career with the United Nations. And they really became his champions. They would sit for hours and ask him what Emperor Haile Selassie was like and what the Empress was like. And Dad loved it because he remembered Africa pretty well from his 20s, even if he often didn't remember like last week or last month. So Memory Well grew out of that experience. And so we now have more than 600 writers across the country. We're working in more than 30 assisted living facilities and home care agencies in 19 states. And we work to replace large swaths of those questionnaires with professionally told stories that we then host digitally and let family members build. And they add their loved ones' favorite music and movies and build a timeline of their life. So anyone sitting with them, whether it's a paid caregiver or a grandchild, they have a whole toolbox of things with which to engage them.
And how do they become volunteers? How do they write the narratives? These 600 writers, they go through your website?
Yeah, so they're not volunteers. We do actually pay our writers, okay. Which is important.
Paid volunteers. That's good.
No, they come to us mostly through our website. And so if you just go to memorywell.com, you can sign up as a writer there.
So describe the power of the media and this story, and of how it took off and how many people noticed it.
So yeah, that was the crazy thing is the Post, when they originally were doing the story about me, they were like, oh, this is just going to be a blog post. And I was like, well, that's great because we're really early stage. Like I left Time right after, my last assignment for Time was covering the Hillary campaign. I left right after the election to go full time on Memory Well. We had really one client, which was St. Paul's House in Chicago, whose stories we've been doing for about a year. But we were just beginning and launching at that point. And so, and then all of a sudden it was like the front page of the Washington Post, and it ran in like 300 papers across the world. It was incredible. We had 3,000 people contact our website, and we were so unprepared for it. It was crazy, but it was amazing, the response, because so many people said, I want this for my parent, or this is, why don't people do this already? You know, I don't understand, like, but this should be done. It's like, and so it was really incredible to see that response.
You obviously learned a lot through your own personal experience, but what have you learned over the last couple of years as being the CEO of Memory Well and from other people's experiences and their stories and their narratives?
So it's been really incredible. I was joking sort of backstage with Bob about how it sort of feels like using my powers for good versus evil a little bit.
Not like political journalism is evil, though.
Nothing evil about that whatsoever. You should see my Twitter feed. It's kind of hilarious. When I talk about Memory Well, it's all like, wow, that's amazing. And if I ever talk about politics, it's like vitriol. It's been really amazing to really, I would say, just capture people's stories. About a month ago, we were in Richmond, Virginia, and we were doing a series of stories. And the one I did, and usually our interviews take half an hour, 45 minutes to interview the residents or their families if they're not able to tell the stories themselves. And this one guy who I was interviewing had this amazing life. He'd been on the front lines of creating artificial intelligence at Texas Instruments, and he had Parkinson's, and he really couldn't talk that much anymore, but he was so adamant that he was going to tell his own story, and it took him an hour and a half to do it. But by the end of it, his wife was in tears. She was filming it. She was like, this is the last time he's really going to ever be able to tell his story. And she was like, thank you so much, for letting him tell the story, like giving him the time and the space to do it. And that those things are just so rewarding to do. I think it's just a really amazing experience to hear these stories and know that you're capturing them and that you're saving them because they otherwise might not be told.
We'll open up for questions. We've got a few minutes left, so if you can just wait for the microphone and raise your hand. Jay Newton Small, any questions?
Lauren Lukey, this is a fantastic idea. And how do you start the conversation with these folks?
So it depends on whether or not they're able to tell their own stories, but oftentimes we'll just start at the beginning. And there's an expression in Alzheimer's and dementia of meeting somebody where they are, right? So, and I learned this the hard way when my dad kept saying, where's your mom? And I'd be like, well, Dad, she died. And then he'd relive her death over and over again. And I was sort of like, okay, you know what? At some point you realized he asked, where's your mom? And I'd be like, you know what? She went for coffee and she'll be right back. And he'd be like, okay, and so, you got to realize that it's regressive often, and they're in a place that's very different than your current reality. And it's really amazing when we're doing the stories how quickly you can realize where they are, right? So they'll react really strongly to certain parts of their life, certain episodes of their life, and that's where you really want to focus. The family often has to fill in the rest, right? They'll have forgotten large swaths of other parts of probably more recent parts of their lives, but. And that's really why we developed the timelines in many ways, is because we wanted to give people visiting their loved ones the ability to meet them where they are. So when I visited my dad and he was in his 30s, when I would say, hey Dad, how old are we? And if he said 30, I'd be like, okay, it's a Beatles and Burt Kempfert day. And if it was 50, then it would be, MASH and Simon and Garfunkel. And so being able to collect all that media and those photos and those stories from different eras, as soon as I realized where he was, I could say, okay, we're going to go right there. And it would give me a whole toolbox of things from that era to engage him. And so, So I think that with the interviews, you do tend to realize pretty quickly where they are. You let them focus on that space, and then oftentimes just collect a lot of the other biographical data from the family members if they're not able to tell the stories themselves.
Regarding, you said that in your experience, they said, I'm a professional writer, let me tell the story of my dad. But a lot of people like process. They like you to fill out the 20-page questionnaire. Has there been difficulty in saying, no, let's do it a different way?
For sure. I mean, these are communities where, it's not, they're not the most innovative places on the planet. Like, one of the big challenges that we had was that a lot of these communities don't have Wi-Fi, right? And so that's why you can print all of the stories and the timelines so that you can put them in care plans or laminate them and put them up on walls. So oftentimes convincing them to try something new, I think, was a challenge. We've been really lucky in that the partners we've worked with so far have been really interested in trying something different. So our biggest client is Brookdale Senior Living, which is the largest provider of senior care in America. We're piloting with our first Medicare Advantage plan, Clover Health, and our first home care agency with Comfort Keepers. And these are all people who are willing to try something different. But certainly in the first few passes of this, when we first started talking to communities, they would be like, wow, that's so different. We don't want to rock the boat. And so.
Yeah, well, I think, I'm not surprised the Washington Post put this on the front page. It is a remarkable story. Please thank Jay Newton Small for joining us this morning. I'll hand it back to Jack.